In this video, we're going to be writing an absolute value function g, whose graph represents the indicated combination of transformations of f. So here we have the f of x equals the absolute value of x, which is our parent function of the absolute value family. We're going to let g be a translation 2 units to the right, followed by a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2. So let's review what those kinds of transformations do to our function. So if we look at our guide, we see that when we're moving to the left or right, we're doing a horizontal translation, and that means that our h value, or our number, is going to go on the inside of our equation where the x goes. Notice that when it says to the right, we see a minus sign there, but when we say to the left, we see a plus sign. So it's kind of opposites. I like to think of it like a hypocrite who's lying to me. It says to the right, but it really writes down like it's going to the left. Then let's take a look at our horizontal stretch and shrink. Here we see that our scale factor is on the inside of our function with the x, so it gets plugged in. Notice that when it tells us the scale factor is 1/3, we're using a 3 in the function. And when it tells us that it's a 2, we're using a 1/2 in the function, which means we're using the reciprocals. So let's go back to our problem and finish it. Coming back to our problem, we see that there are two things that we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing a translation 2 units to the right. So remember, to the right means we're going to see a minus sign there. And then it says followed by, which means we're going to have 2 different steps here. Then we're doing a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2. And because it's a horizontal stretch, we're not going to be using a 2 in our equation, but it's reciprocal, which is 1/2. So basically, we're going to be doing 2 pieces, 1, 2. Now, because we want our equation to be called g of x, that means that we're going to start our second equation with g of x. Well, we don't want our first part to be called g of x because it's going to change names. So we can pick any letter we want. So I'm going to pick h. So we're going to say that h of x equals our f of x with the translation 2 units to the right. And from what we just saw, that means that we're going to have f times x minus 2, which means that when we're plugging that into our equation, x minus 2 is going to go into the x's spot. So let's plug that in. So we can say that h of x equals the absolute value, except we're not just going to put an x there. In this space right here, that's where x would normally go. We're going to replace that with our x minus 2. And here we can see there's nothing to combine or distribute. And so we see that our h of x equals the absolute value of x minus 2. And now we're ready for the second step. We're ready to do our followed by. So now we're going to say we want our new equation, our g of x, to be a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2 of our h of x. So that means that we're going to be writing h instead of f because we're making this change to our h. And now we're going to be putting our scale factor, which remember, it's not 2, it's the reciprocal, so 1/2 of x. And so again, all of that is going to go into our x's spot. So this 1/2 x is going to go into that x's spot right there. So now we have that g of x equals the absolute value, and remember, all of that's going to go into our x's spot. So we have 1/2 x. And then we still have that minus 2 right there. Now if we look at this, that 1/2 doesn't have anything to distribute to, and there's nothing for the negative 2 to combine with. or our minus 2 to combine with. So we're left with g of x equals the absolute value of 1/2 x minus 2. And that's going to be our answer there. So now let's move on to part B. In part B, we're told that f of x equals the absolute value of x. And it says let g be a reflection in or across the y-axis, followed by, which means we're going to be doing 2 steps again, a translation 3 units to our right. Now we remember that when we have a translation to our right, that we're really going to be seeing a minus sign. But what about a reflection? What does that do? Well, let's go take a look. So here we see that when we're doing a reflection, whether it flips over the x or the y-axis, that's going to involve multiplying by a negative, either on the inside, where our x is, or in front of the equation, all depending on if we're reflecting across our x-axis or our y-axis. So let's go back to our problem and work that out. So we see here that we're going to be reflecting across the y-axis. And so just like in our last problem, our followed by means we're going to have 2 parts. 1, our reflection across the y-axis, and 2, our translation 3 units to the right, which means that we're also going to need another random letter, because our g of x is what we're going to use in our second part. So I'm just going to go ahead and use h of x again. So remember that a reflection across the y-axis means that our negative sign is going to go on the inside. So as we write this, we're going to have f of negative x. So that means that we're going to be plugging in this negative x into the x spot in our original equation, which means that our h of x is going to equal the absolute value of, and remember, in our x's spot, that's where we're going to be plugging in our negative x. So in our x's spot, we're plugging in our negative x. And we see that there's nothing to distribute or combine, and so we see that our h of x is just the absolute value of negative x. And so now, because we're dealing with absolute value functions and our leading coefficient is a negative, we actually want to factor out a -1, which gives us the h of x equals the absolute value of -1, remember we factored out that -1, times the absolute value of x. Now the absolute value of -1 is 1, which means that we're going to be left with h of x equaling the absolute value of x. So now we can do our followed by. We can do our part 2. So part 2 says that we're going to take h of x and translate that 3 units to the right. So for g of x, we're going to take our h of x and we're going to translate that 3 units to the right. So now we're going to be plugging all of this into our x spot right there. So now our g of x is going to equal the absolute value of, don't forget, we're going to plug in our x minus 3 into this spot. And we see that there's nothing to distribute or combine, and so we're going to have g of x equals the absolute value of x minus 3. And we're finished.